IPMNation.com.
Living in a city when you're in it, watch the people walk by. And if you listen real close, you can hear them talk about their lives. And some hate it, some love it, some are thought, some are just tired. These are the people in the neighborhood, they just trying to make it out right. See, she never wanna be a New
Good evening, everybody. This is Dr. John, and you've tuned in to Dr. John's Neighborhood. I'm delighted to have you with me today. I'm very excited about the guest that I'm going to be interviewing in the second half of the show. His name is Mr. Stephen Krasner. He has been involved in family court in various ways over the past number of years, and he's written a book about his experiences in family court. So we're going to be talking to him about his book and about divorce and child custody battles and the setup of the court system, which he argues is not very fair and not set up in a way that is considering the best interests of the children involved. So I promise that will be an engaging conversation. Prior to that, I'm introducing you to a conversation that I had with Matt Connarton, who's a radio host at WMNH in New Hampshire. You can listen to his show at WMNH.org. I'm a regular guest on his show every other Wednesday. I appear and I talk about some psychological topic with him. And so the first half of the show is going to feature a conversation that I had with him that I think is related to the interview with Mr. Krasner. And that conversation is going to be about how trauma in childhood can impact the future relationships that we have, particularly romantic relationships, and the kinds of impacts that having negative childhood experiences can have on the mates that we select and the people that we're attracted to, and some of the ways that we engage in communication with our partners. So I welcome you to listen to this great conversation that I had with Matt Connarton. We'll go to a commercial break after that, and then we'll speak with Mr. Krasner about family court. Enjoy.
I think this is this Dr. Rich?
It is.
Welcome, sir. Dr. John D. Rich Jr. Joins us. How are you?
I'm fine. I have a request. I was wondering if you have a couple people there in the room. Maybe on the count of three, we could all just talk all at the same time. How would that be?
So we could sound like CNN?
Well, wait a minute, though. That happens on this show anyway. I mean, it doesn't typically happen during your segment because we don't really get into politics. But I can assure you, Doctor, there are plenty of times that happens on this show.
That people are talking at the same time.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But welcome, Dr. John D. Rich Jr. It's good to talk to you. And
yeah, I had to skip out on you last week.
Yes.
Thanks for being flexible.
Oh, always. Of course, we should remind everyone a couple things. So you have a show that airs online on IPM Nation on Fridays, Dr. John's Neighborhood.
Right.
And, of course,
that's been going for a bit now. I think I'm up to show number 8 or something like that.
Yeah. So it's been a couple of months. Yeah. And, of course, you also have the column, your syndicated column, which is can be found in, among other places, Manchester Inklink, where all things Manchester connect.
That's right.
Yes. And
yes. In fact, if you go to the radio show, too, this might be of interest to some of your listeners. The last show that got broadcast was Carol Robidoux was the guest on the show.
Right.
So I know a lot of people
on Dr. John's
who are
Neighborhood,
out there
yes.
know who she is.
Yeah. Carol's on here weekdays in the morning. She does, you probably know this already, but she does a morning segment. Well, she calls into the morning show, I think at 7:30. Weekday mornings.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So sometimes she's here in the studio with the guys on the morning show with Peter White and the Moose, but she either calls or she comes in. So she's got some radio experience herself.
I could tell from when we were talking, she was a very easy guest.
Yes. No, it was she's very, very nice. So what did, so you and I communicated earlier, and the subject that, you had suggested we discuss, I thought, for one thing, it's one of those things that I think a lot of people might find, helpful to hear about, because it's, something we all have to, deal with in some way at some point in our lives, dealing with trauma. And you had suggested discussing about, trauma and how unresolved trauma can affect future relationships. And I think that's, I think John Hopwood's going to join us for this discussion as well. So,
okay.
Hi, John. He pulled the mic in front of him, but then when I say hi to him, he waves.
Teasing. I think it's called teasing.
Yes.
It's called being tired.
Yes.
Well, I don't want him talking at the same time as I'm talking.
Right.
That's my only...
Right. Yeah. Well, not John would never do that, would you, John? He's yawning. Poor guy.
We could get one of those ticket spitters like they have at the deli counter, like you pull a number.
Oh, I like that idea,
And then, when you're ready to speak, you pull the number, and when your number comes up, and Matt says, number 3 finish, who's got number 4?
There you go. That would be very organized.
It would.
A little too organized for me, I suppose. But
you'd have to send me my own number counter, I guess.
Right.
Oh, that's true.
I guess we could do it digitally.
Yeah, you can do almost anything digitally nowadays.
Yeah. You've got a pretty good setup, too. Usually I listen to you before the show so I can make some dumb joke, reading into it. And I just go to WMNH, but this was the first time that I've actually seen that, you're on Facebook there. And you can watch the show, and it shows you how many people are also in the room. And
yes.
You can like it and share it and all that stuff, so you're getting all fancy.
Absolutely, yeah. We get a lot of interaction in the Facebook live chat, so it's very wonderful.
I need to figure that out. If I'm going to stay in radio, I think I need to get better technology. I'm still using. I have a can, and there's a string attached to the can.
Oh wow!
And then I have a bird inside of some kind of contraption, who gets lowered onto a record, and it spins, and we record that way.
That's old school.
No, that's pre his master's voice.
Reference? No.
Yeah.
I got the Flintstone piece. Yeah, yabba dabba doo.
Yeah. Wow.
Right.
Well, the problem with this Facebook thing is that it's a challenge with those of us who've got faces for radio. So
right. That's true. Now you've got everyone can see what Matt looks like, and luckily he's interesting, because otherwise it might be a distraction.
Yeah, well, we get to big time someday, and when he has his makeup artist in here and people are fluffing him and brushing him as the 4 o'clock hour comes up, we'll know he's hit the big time. He's ready to go.
Oh, yeah? Really? They come in and put the makeup on him and everything?
No, not quite. But I'm saying when he gets to there, he may one of these days they'll be trimming the beard.
Oh, I see. Right.
Grooming the eyebrows. And
I don't know about the fluffing, though. I think that's for a different kind of show. I think you got something else in mind there. But everything else sounds great.
Yeah.
That's why the Tuesday show is so interesting.
Right, yes. That's more for the other show that I do, actually, the Matt Connarton Unsheathed, which, as you know, is only available on the dark web.
That's the fluffing.
There's fluffing before the show.
Okay,
yes.
so here we do huffing and puffing.
Right, no fluffing. Because that would be against the Facebook rules. So.
And Matt, do you ever do the show shirtless? I hear that you've got a lot of body hair.
Putin-esque
for Facebook.
Well, the thing is, I'm so hairy, being a Yeti American, that even if I remove my shirt, it still looks like I'm wearing a sweater.
It would still look like you're wearing, or it would be like in the 60s when people wore the hair shirt, except you'd put the hair on the inside.
Right. But I believe, too, there's rules here at the station about, because nobody wants hair in the board here. So I think there's a rule about that. I think it's probably an unwritten, unspoken rule, but just something, folks of my persuasion are expected to assume. You know what I mean?
I do. It's like, how did you learn to walk into an elevator and then turn around and look at the door? Nobody ever told you that. You just
Right.
you see how everybody else acts, and you know what's expected.
Right, exactly.
Except when you go to those places, there's a couple of them that come to mind. One is Central High School in Manchester. Another one is the school district in Manchester. Both of the elevators in both of those buildings, you go in when you go there first. You get in the elevator and you do just as you described. You go in, you turn around, you face the door, and then you get to the floor you want to get out on, and you feel a cold breeze hit your back, and you turn around, and
The other side
is open.
Uh-huh.
So you look a little foolish. At least I did the first couple of times I did it, and then I worked it all out.
Well, that can be traumatizing.
Well, some people.
Oh,
I think
is that your segue? Really? That's your segue.
And I think that trauma can affect your future relationships.
That's awful.
And there has to be ways to deal with that, right? There has to be.
Right. If only you had somebody who might be able to talk about that.
Well,
yes.
he elevated the conversation to that point, so that's wonderfully well done.
Thank you. Yes, seamless. I would say
That was fantastic.
I seamlessly elevated the conversation.
Yeah.
Yes. What a CQ.
Oh, so now I'm supposed to start talking, right? Because you have led us from jokes to something serious.
Now that I've elevated the discussion, you can feel free to. I mean, you're going to benefit directly from that. Now, you can say something. It's going to be awesome.
Okay. Yeah. So I thought that what I could do to kind of frame this conversation. So the idea of the conversation is that, in almost everybody's life, there's a certain level of trauma.
Yes.
People die who are close to us, or we have, a near-death experience, or people who are in the military are in situations like that. Women might have some kind of sexual assault experience. I mean, men can as well, but predominantly women. And so trauma is a part of life, and there are certain techniques that are, they're difficult to implement for people who have experienced trauma, but they can be effective. And I guess the message that I wanted to have was that, if you have a traumatic event and you're having things like flashbulb memories, flashbacks, certain kinds of, you're so scared that the traumatic event is going to pop into your brain again, and it's affecting your life, where you're not leaving the house or you're avoiding certain activities or certain areas, that it is important to get help, because if you leave it unresolved, it's still unresolved. It's still there acting, even if you're thinking that you're not addressing it. So the story that I have is the story of my own childhood, and it's something that still affects me to some degree. So when I was young, I was about 4, 5, 6 years old, right in that age range. My grandmother, my father's mother, came to live with us. I'm not sure exactly why she was living with us instead of living on her own. I was too young to even think to ask that question.
Sure.
But she was a pretty mentally deranged person. And one of the things that happened to me over the course of these years is my parents would go out. Maybe I don't know where they were going, to the movies or whatever. They would leave me in her care. And one of the things that she would do on a pretty routine basis is she would send me to bed, and then she would wait until I was asleep, and then she would come in and she would hit me with the belt and wake me up with the belt.
Oh, my God. Wow.
Yeah, it's terrible, right?
How often would this occur? Was this a regular thing?
I mean, it was regular in that any time I was going to be left alone with her, I was expecting it to happen.
Wow.
But I wasn't left alone with her on a routine basis, so it might occur every 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, wow.
And so it got to the point, where my parents would leave, and it would be very difficult for me to fall asleep.
Yeah, no doubt. Wow.
I'm a young child, and eventually a young child is going to fall asleep. And what happened is that I got trained to recognize, even though I was sleeping, I got trained to recognize the sound of the doorknob jiggling.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd go to bed, and eventually I'd fall asleep. And then, even though I was asleep, as soon as I heard that doorknob, my body woke me up.
Yeah.
And my brain was like, it was like an alarm, even though I'm sure it wasn't a very loud sound. And I'm not sure what good that did, except that I guess I could prepare myself consciously for the beating instead of, it's not very nice to wake up being hit.
Yeah, no kidding, huh?
Yeah. So, every once in a while I see these prank shows or these YouTube videos where people, somebody is asleep and then they go up behind them and they like clash a cymbal or they make a really loud noise or something like that. And
Yeah.
that would set me off. I think.
Yeah.
I'm not prepared to be woken up in an abrupt fashion like that.
By the way, when this was going on, would she say anything? Was there any indication to you I mean, I know you were just little, but do you recall there being any indication as to what it was that might have been going on in her mind as she was hitting you with the belt? Or did she say anything as she was doing it?
No, she just told me that I better not tell my parents.
Okay.
I mean, that's all I remember. But there was never any conversation about, there was no talking or whatever.
Yeah. Okay.
She'd hit me for a bit and then she would leave and then
Wow.
I'd cry and then I'd go back to sleep.
Jeez.
So I think that, for me, the fact that I write a lot about spanking and trying to use forms of discipline or punishment with your children that are not violent like that, has a particular resonance because of that experience of my own. Yeah. And I raised both of my children without ever hitting them. And unless there's somebody out there who thinks that you have to hit your kids or they're going to end up being spoiled, I've got some, two pretty well-behaved children. And so I would contradict what they had to say about that.
Right.
But back to my story. So the purpose of the story is not to get a pity party for myself as much as to talk about this issue of classical conditioning that people may have heard of when they went to college, Pavlov's dogs, and how. So, for example, Pavlov had these dogs, and then he was going to feed them, and he was testing their digestion. I know we talked about this before.
Yeah.
And he found that when the person who was bringing the food would ring this bell to be let into the room, eventually the dog began to salivate at the sound of the bell, even though the food had still not been brought into the dog's presence. And Pavlov had no intention of studying classical conditioning or inventing anything. He cared about digestion. He was a physical scientist, but he noticed that this was going on, and this turned into a whole area of classical conditioning where we learn that certain sensory input can help us predict something that's about to occur. And so that's what happened with me, is I got trained to wake up at the sound of the doorknob, even though I was presumably asleep. There was a part of my brain that was waiting for that to happen.
Yeah.
So, there have been times, even as an adult, and I've, tried to address this kind of thing, but there's still this part of my brain where I'll be asleep and one of my kids needs something and comes in the room, and the sound of the door opening still wakes me up with a little bit of a startle.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. So how is that connected to other types of trauma? Well, thinking about soldiers with PTSD, for example, and how they might be out in traffic and they hear a car backfire, and the sound of the backfire triggers this memory of something that happened out on the battlefield. It sounds like a bomb, or it sounds like a gun, or something like that.
Yeah,
Our
it's not just sound
are
either.
So adept at trying to protect us from danger that cue is the same kind of cue. It's just like the doorknob, that it's preparing the body for danger, even though the soldier is no longer in danger. Was Was he going to say something?
Oh no, John was just commenting that it's not just sound either, that can trigger that.
That can be a pattern of life, a pattern of light thrown off by leaves, for instance. And
Sure.
You'll see that pattern again, and you'll be back there.
Yeah, no doubt.
There's all sorts of cues.
Yeah. Yeah, John's
Yeah,
a
sure,
veteran.
right. So I'm just using the backfire because that's the example that came to mind.
Yeah.
Same kind of thing. So, some psychologists say that our brains are biased toward protecting us from danger, meaning that it takes a little bit longer for us to put sensory cues together with pleasurable sensations that are coming. But sensory input that is being used to protect us from being killed can be learned almost immediately. It doesn't take very long at all, and it's a pretty powerful mechanism that goes on in the brain.
Yeah, so that's so it's actually a good thing in a sense that our brains work that way because it protects us. It's just
right.
Then a question I would have, is so it's still very subjective, right? Because you put two people in exactly the same circumstance, but even the exact same at the same time, like two people who are sitting side by side in an MRAP or sitting side by side in the trench, or two police officers who go through the same traffic accident. And obvious, there's something going on, right? That they won't. It's not a straight line, that this happens and therefore you'll respond this way. The individuals respond based on something else, right? Something that's subjective.
You mean that you could have two soldiers in the same situation and one of them gets a PTSD type symptoms and the other one seems to be able to recover more quickly. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying, not to get too pedantic about it, but yes, I'm saying that. But I'm also saying that, so one of them actually perceives it as a very stressful and traumatic event, and the other does not. And then a second case is they both perceive it as a very traumatic event, but one of them has ongoing issues as a result of that traumatic and stressful event, and the other one has found, I don't mean a coping mechanism like alcohol or, a coping mechanism like a crutch of some kind, but they simply find some way to move beyond it. So, it's obviously, there's something very subjective that goes on at that time. So it's more in the perception of the person looking at the event than what's inherent in the event itself, I would imagine.
Yeah. Well, you said at the risk, you don't want to be too pedantic, so tell me if this is too pedantic. But one of the interesting things about this hypothetical scenario where two people are in the same traumatic experience and one of them is more resilient than the other, there is some evidence that there's some genetic proclivity that certain people have to be more affected by dangerous situations. And of course, that's not going to come to the fore unless a person is put in a very dangerous situation. But so two parts of the brain, one of them is the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that is getting us ready for fight or flight type things. It's the fear response, comes from that part of the brain. And so people who, there's evidence that people who develop PTSD symptoms actually have more active amygdala sections of the brain, that part of the brain is more active. So in other words, that they get, when there's a dangerous situation, their fear switch sends a lot more electricity flowing through the body than somebody else. So not that that's with everybody, and not that that's the entire explanation, but there's that. And then another part of the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus seems to be related to being able to tell that a certain situation, like the sound of the doorknob, is very specific to a very specific context. So people who are highly affected by traumatic experiences, there's a statistically significant difference in how large that part of the brain actually is, meaning that people who are more predisposed to PTSD-like symptoms have smaller hippocampi, so they're more likely to take a traumatic experience and generalize it.
Okay.
So
Yeah, but why wouldn't
that's pedantic?
How do you not know that the hippocampi or the amygdala are smaller because of the trauma they went through?
Right. So, I mean, the way that they've answered that question is by looking at twins. So taking twins where one of the twins developed some kind of PTSD in an experience, and then taking a look at the parts of the brain of the twin who wasn't in that experience, and those are, significantly different in size and activity.
Okay. But I think, John, it sounds like... I was just going to say, John Hopwood, it sounds like you're asking, though, so can the traumatic experience affect the size of that part of the brain? Yes. I mean, does that... Okay, so the size... So in other words, instead of necessarily the size of that part of the brain affecting how you respond to that traumatic experience, can that traumatic experience actually shrink that part of the brain?
Right. So I would say that if it's going to go in that direction, if you're going to try to explain it that way, it's less likely that the hippocampus has changed in size, because that doesn't really happen.
Okay.
But it is possible that the amygdala is reacting at a more heightened level than it used to as a result of being turned on to that degree. So that is possible. It's a good point.
I think John has hippocampus envy.
Oh, we talk about we talk about this all the time up at the VA.
The other thing is, when you think about it, when people have been sort of did I cut across you, John?
Yeah, because I'm talking. I'm actually I'm working on something right now, aren't I?
Yes. Okay.
Because when you're talking about right now, like I've been here with Jim, you've triggered me, haven't you? So what?
Oh yes.
Because you just mentioned GI once or Iraq.
It was Kabul, Afghanistan.
Once you just say things, and it can trigger you. But we're always talking about what you're talking about right now, and
absolutely, yeah.
I'll just give you a scenario. No, I can't talk about it because I'll be talking about something that happened in a group.
Okay.
So I think about there's also the way I talked about the way in which people respond to it. So you think about violence, and violent events, right? So you think about a slave in a galley in sort of in ancient Greece, right? And the level from what is depicted, the level of violence was pretty severe, right? So at some point, violence inflicted upon somebody who has been abused has been brutalized already, then it takes something different to have them go to the next level, right? So it's like I think about kids, for instance, growing up in the 1960s or so, and where corporal punishment in school was just something that happened all the time. Nuns with leather straps or whatever it might be. Teachers with canes and all that stuff. I think not, and I don't buy into the fact at all, or the idea at all, that people are softer today. But I think if you walked into a school in Manchester today as a teacher and you took out a cane and you whacked any one of the kids in front of you like 3 or 4 times with a cane, that would be a pretty traumatic experience for those kids.
Of course.
I think the same set of kids in 1950 with a Christian brother or something, not to malign the Christian brothers, but whatever teacher it might be, and having a cane would have been... So the only point I'm saying, I guess, is that it's all sort of contextual, right?
That's interesting, because I was thinking about that, Jim. I'll just say, some people can experience extreme violence, and what can I say? Why isn't so-and-so here? Well, we were talking about killing people, and the other guy's got the same thing. Oh, why would that upset him?
Right.
One person's working something out, the other isn't ready to now.
Yeah.
But I know what you're saying, because my father.
Well, yeah,
was
I mean, you
world.
can talk about this in any domain. You can talk about, like, my father was chronically depressed for a good part of my childhood, and the kinds of, if I were to tell you some of the things that happened to him, there you could find any number of people who had things like that happen to them, and they didn't become mentally ill as a result of it. So there is, a certain amount of mystery to why some people are able to bounce back from it and other people are not.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of it has to do with just the cumulative weight of multiple experiences. So,
Yeah.
I think most people can bounce back from one traumatic event, but if you have 4 or 5 or 6 really heavy-duty things happen to you, it's harder and harder to be able to handle that.
Mm-hmm.
Incidentally, on the corporal punishment thing, I just learned this 2 weeks ago. Is I got invited to speak at a conference. It's a conference trying to get parents to not. It's an anti-spanking conference, basically.
Okay.
And not the kind of spanking that you're thinking of, Matt. I'm talking about spanking your children.
Right. Not the kind that goes on Matt Connarton Unsheathed, the other show.
Exactly.
Right. Not that kind.
Exactly.
Right.
And what I discovered was that there are still 19 states where it's legal to use corporal punishment in the classroom.
Really?
I was not aware of that.
Huh.
And
in the Bible.
Most of them are Midwest and South, but one of them is Colorado. You would think that Colorado was a pretty progressive state that wouldn't allow that.
You're here on the air in the great state of New Hampshire, and just in the last 2 weeks, this is tangential, but in the last 2 weeks, the state legislature in New Hampshire, and not unanimously, but managed to change the law that it's no longer legal for a 14-year-old girl to be married in the state of New Hampshire. We moved it to 16 because
16.
Yeah, and the argument made by those people who didn't want to move it, if you can imagine this, it had to do with the military. This is a pretty.
Oh, Jim, come on, you're going off on it.
I'm just saying the argument they made. The argument
Yeah,
they
if you
made
can
was
kill
that
somebody
was
at
that
17, you can
the
marry a
argument that
girl.
was made was that if some young man had gotten his girlfriend pregnant and he was heading off to war, he should be able to marry her before he departed. The fact that she was 14, and so anyway, it
people
just
aren't marrying. You have to have a judge and all that, Jim. Come on.
I'm just making the point.
I know because we've been talking about this
talk
before.
about corporal punishment and the sort of how retrograde, how sort of antiquated, and how uncivilized some laws can be. And it's amazing when you look at these things that these things are tolerated, and that's the analogy, right? That corporal punishment is okay. You said in 18 states still.
19
states, and
19,
and marrying a girl getting married at 14 is still legal in some states, or at least it was here until 2 weeks
with
ago.
a judge, and you're
Understood.
Blah,
So
blah,
you know,
blah.
yeah.
All right.
Go back to the traumatization.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about what you're getting at, they say that a rape for a woman is equivalent to what a person goes through in combat, which is about both their equivalent is as bad as a trauma can get.
Yeah, I would
going through
can
combat.
imagine, yeah. I would imagine so.
Yeah, it's just. I just want to know, in your opinion, is there hope? Because I know people have gone through both, and it is a decades-long process to recover from either event. What would your opinion?
Yeah, well,
of that be?
so it has kind of a backwards logic, but in the interest of time, I'll just do this, and then maybe when I come on next, we can continue the conversation because we didn't even talk about the impact on relationships later.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
One of the
that's a
things
big thing,
one of the things that they've been doing with soldiers that it has been shown to be pretty effective for some people, but pretty interesting, is the use of virtual reality. So let's go back to the dog. So the dog salivates when the bell is rung because the dog knows that the bell means that food is coming. So the way you get the dog to stop salivating to the bell is you ring the bell and then you don't bring the food. And if you do that over and over again, then the dog finally realizes, well, the bell doesn't mean anything anymore. And so with traumatic experiences, one of the things that they're finding for certain people, and they haven't narrowed down which people are more resonant with this type of therapy and which aren't, but you can use virtual reality to put somebody back into the situation where the flashbacks are occurring. So you can actually program a virtual reality scenario that mimics the traumatic event. And the brain is simultaneously re-experiencing it, but also somewhat knowing that it's not dangerous anymore.
Right.
So you're kind of separating the sensory input from the feelings of fear. That takes a long time.
Yeah.
It's a lot of sessions, but it's just an interesting way that technology is, helping us kind of look at certain things that before were either ridiculed or denied, or we threw up our hands and said, "Oh, it's terrible. Sorry."
Well, are you changing the outcome in that virtual reality? Are they changing the story to some degree, the script?
Well, so it has a format like desensitization, where you have something like people with phobias. You expose them to as much as they can handle, and then you let them walk away. And then maybe after doing that a few times, then they're able to take another step in the direction. Maybe somebody who's afraid of flying, you would start them by they look at a book of some planes, and then maybe they go to the airport and look at the planes taking off, and
that's where cognitive behavioral therapy
sit in an airplane seat or something like that.
Well,
so how you're changing the outcome is that you're allowing the soldier the control, because control is part of the issue. You're allowing the soldier control over how far into the story he or she goes before he or she says, "Okay, that's all I want to do."
Look, it reminds me a little bit, and John asking about changing the outcome reminds me of this too. In hypnotherapy, we have a technique, a neurolinguistic programming technique I learned called swishing, where you re-experience the memory. And what I tell my clients is, imagine, your mind, your imagination has a big movie theater screen onto which you can project, onto it any memory you want to, and you replay the memory. But there's a couple ways to do it. Either you change the outcome, and then you replay that new version of the memory over and over in your mind with the new outcome, or what I like to do is take the memory, and this is a method that works better for me, just for the way my mind is wired. You replay the memory, but you distort it in some way. Like you put circus music behind it, or if there's a particular person in the memory who upset you, you make it so they talk like Mickey Mouse or something, so that you can no longer take them seriously, or turn it into a cartoon, do with it whatever you want, and then you replay that new version of the memory over and over again. And then what begins to happen is you start to emotionally disassociate from the original memory, because it's as though you've changed it, you've literally rewritten it and replaced it in your mind, and the original memory almost starts to feel like it's something
its power.
Right. It almost begins to seem like it's something that happened to somebody else, like somebody else told you a story, but not something that you actually experienced. And
what
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I actually need to end the conversation.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I was actually going to reach out to you and see whether you'd be interested in being on my show to talk about the hypnosis piece.
I would love to. I would absolutely love it.
Okay, I'll get in touch with you and try to set up a time when
definitely
we can talk.
It would be my honor.
I think that would be interesting.
It would be my honor. Yes.
All right. That's Dr. John's Neighborhood. We kind of take a look at things from a psychological standpoint, and so that would be another way to be applying psychology to everyday life.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry we didn't get as far into it as I wanted to, but I still think that it's pretty interesting how the brain will put together a certain sensory experience with a feeling of danger, and then try to use that in the future to protect the person. And it's almost like this thing that from an evolutionary standpoint, we should all be very happy that our brain is wired to do that. And yet with trauma, it ends up going a little bit haywire.
Yes, absolutely. All right, Doctor. Well, we will let you go. Dr. John D. Rich Jr., thank you so much. Always a pleasure. And we'll talk again soon. And obviously, we'll talk online. And I look forward to being on your program.
IPMNation.com.
And we're back. Thanks for sticking around. I'm delighted to have our guest for this evening, Mr. Stephen Krasner. Say hello, Stephen.
Hi, John. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for having me on. It's an honor.
Oh, well, the honor is all mine. So you're a pretty interesting person, and you've got a lot of experience and a book where you're talking about the family court system. And before we jump into the book and some of the findings that you've had, I wanted to give you a chance to just introduce yourself to the listeners.
Sure. As you mentioned, I go by Steve most of the times.
Okay.
I was like anybody else. I grew up in the D.C. area, in the suburbs in Maryland, and spent my younger years there. And after that, I relocated to New York and have been here probably for the past, I want to say, 7 or 8 years. And in between all that, I spent some time in the Peace Corps in South America doing work down there. Was involved in politics, ran for office, ran some political campaigns, and I spent quite a bit of time working in the legal industry as a paralegal in some various different law firms in the litigation areas. So it's kind of run the gamut in terms of my activity level and career pursuits.
And did you intend at the beginning to be involved in family law? It doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody that becomes active in speaking out or subsequently writing about it intends to go into it. In fact, it's usually because of personal experience that a lot of folks open the door to pursuing that, as it was in my case, having gone through my own ordeal and not pursuing any kind of writing or speaking out until certain points reached a conclusion. But it's a tough thing to write about. From a personal perspective, it's tough because you're reliving your own situation a lot of times.
Yeah.
When you're talking to the folks that you're interviewing or writing about, and having them rehash their experiences, and a lot of times they're going through their own ordeals as you're asking and talking about it. So it's hard. It's a hard topic.
And so you were going through your own family issue with the court system while writing the book, or while doing the interviews that make up what the book is about?
I waited until there was a certain juncture that once it concluded in the courts after a few years, actually, there was a certain juncture that I felt everybody, in terms of even my ex to some extent, were in a place where things were more secure. They weren't perfect. There were certain elements that were still post-divorce that were not, at the best place. But our child, at least, was just about equally spending time with mom and dad when all was said and done. Mm-hmm. And there were certain protections that were in place for everybody that made it very difficult for more litigation to ensue.
Okay.
So when I reached that point, I began to speak out about it.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, having not been in the family court system, my wife does some work with foster children, and so I hear things from her. But it sounds like if you're involved with the family court system, it can be just very time-consuming. It maybe take up all of your mental energy.
Yeah, no, I think litigation in general is in such a way that there's so many parts to litigation, and when you involve it with custody battles and divorce situations, unlike all the other areas of law, this is an area that, especially if you're going through it, it's just the substance of what goes on is so different than a lot of the other civil events that you hear about in the courts, because you're dealing with raw emotion, and you're dealing with it on a human level with mothers, fathers, and kids. And I think a lot of times you'll hear these nightmarish stories that go on in these courts, and you have several actors at play. You have the parents who, some of them justify, whether the hearsay is fiction or not. They'll embellish a lot of things and tell themselves that they're doing it for the best interest of their child. Uh-huh. And that's how they sleep at night and justify it. Whereas, another parent could walk in there and just tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and end up, in the short end of the stick, which is usually what happens in this area of law. And it's just, at the end of the day, nobody wins. And I think that's the underlying message. Nobody wins all around. But it certainly isn't helped when you're dealing with an infrastructure that is, not exactly transparent, as I discovered, and a lot of other people have discovered. There's a lot of dysfunction in the family law industry. And, before I went through my own experience, look, I worked in the industry for, 20 years now? And so my faith in the judiciary, my faith in the legal system was pretty up there. I've been involved in quite a bit of matters, but never in family law.
Right.
Never had I been thrown into that situation. So
you actually, sorry to interrupt, but you actually are, I know that you write specifically about the family court system, but you're specifically saying that the family court system has some real issues to it that are specific to itself. Is that as opposed to other forms of law?
Without question.
Okay, so
even,
when you talk
even
about
the type of people that are attracted to that kind of court system in terms of the lawyers and the judges, you really have to question their incentives. You have to question how they conduct themselves in terms of professional conduct. And, one thing I will say is, in terms of the area of professional conduct and or misconduct, rather, there's a lot of ethical exclamation points that come up, and they're documented, and they play out in open court. And there's no entity, there's no task force, there's no oversight with teeth that is, that really can do anything about it. And that's what I found most discouraging is, a lot of people are getting away with a lot of practices that if you have any experience in litigation, if you know what to look for, if you, are involved in discovery process, and you know what these terms are, and you understand how things should play out, what plays out in this area of law is uniquely different. And what folks are getting away with is even more concerning. And oftentimes it's because there's no oversight. There's really there's a lot of window dressing, as I call it, where the courts like to puff themselves up and make it look like that such entities exist. But, when I pursued it, look, perjury happens all the time in these courts. And that would fall under the district attorney's office to investigate and follow up on. But they have to do that at the behest of the court itself, calling for such investigations. And that, I can tell you from research, that doesn't happen a lot, if ever.
Just because of money and time, or?
It's more mostly, I've discovered it's mostly because of politics, and mostly because, I think a lot of these DA's offices don't follow up with the family court situations. Well, in the areas of perjury and whatnot, because they don't view it as, something to be taken seriously. They just figure it's a family court. People are going to not tell the truth. It's, drama that should be looked in a different direction upon. They don't want to pursue it because it's a waste of resources, I think, is how they view it. But the problem is when you boil it down to, what really transpires, kids are ending up, in foster care situations. They're ending up, with one parent over another. And sometimes what you see play out, is a lot of the obstruction of bonds between kids and their parents that happen, because one parent tries to change the situation as such so that the other parent is a non-factor in the life. And it's sad, and, it's unfortunately a byproduct of what goes on. But, all of it starts somewhere. And the somewhere that I, find a lot of it starting is at the top. If you have judges, you have lawyers, you have, third parties associated with these courts that are not living up to the oaths that they took when they entered the profession and are not upholding, the rules of professional conduct, then everybody suffers. And it trickles down the system. And, if nothing's going to stop a system that is so profitable and so big from, taking advantage of folks, then it's going to continue to do so. And that's kind of where a lot of my research has led. And I'm giving you the broad overall observations I've made, but there's actual empirical data that supports this. And it's hushed up so many times. And what you're starting to see, though, I think in the past 5-10 years is because of the advent of social media, because everybody's got, cell phones that can capture images and record video and audio and whatnot, more and more of this stuff is coming out in terms of what plays out in the courtrooms, plays out with, social workers from Child Protective Services, and foster care environments. I mean, some of the files and things I've viewed just on my own, it's shocking to say the least. And what's more shocking is when the parent has witnessed this and has evidence of certain wrongdoings, whether it's wrongdoings that the attorney committed or lawyers in general, or the judges or third parties, and they present this evidence, and there's no one to present it to. It's disturbing on many levels.
Can you be more concrete about the wrongdoings that you're talking about? You're talking about unethical behavior, and so
Sure.
We've talked about perjury, but so what other kinds of things are happening that you would classify not as just evidence of the sickness of the system, but actually the individuals involved doing things that they really have to know are not the right way to do them? Can you give us examples of that?
Sure. One of the big ones that I started questioning at first was the whole thing in family law where you're giving two lawyers for either side. They get what's called a net worth statement. And, what I often see is you have one side who has more resources and money, and it's all listed out on the net worth statement, and then another side who maybe have equally as much money and resources. And a lot of times what you notice is, whereas if it was two people that did not have the same economics and fell on the more poor end of the scale,
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't see a case play out extensively. It could be the same factors, the same evidence, and what I'm trying to say is, a lot of times you'll see these lawyers kind of work in tandem to make sure that the billable hours extend into motion after motion and responsiveness after that. And having myself worked in this industry, I recognize that almost immediately in my own case. But this happens on a grander scale, so people are really kind of losing a lot of their financial securities over these kinds of cases. And you'll find that those that are wealthier, they've got a lot to lose, and it's needlessly played out when these things should settle rather quickly for everyone's best interest. But because a lot of greed has entered the system, and because a lot of the attorneys in family law, like their lifestyles and they make a lot of money, they do so almost at the manipulation of people's emotions, and the fact that they have the knowledge. Both lawyers on both sides have the knowledge of exactly how much money is at stake, and so does the court. And that's the real dilemma, and that's the real concerning thing. And that's one of many. Look, you have a lot of states where judges are elected, and that presents another huge problem.
Okay,
they're elected in for example, I can speak quite extensively on my own county in New York, which is Orange County. These folks are elected. Every some of the terms are on average like 4 to 6 years, but the people, you always want to follow the money in a lot of these situations. And the unique thing about elected judges is you can actually do that. You can look at their campaign disclosure forms.
Right.
You can see, well, who's donating to their campaign. And what I discovered in my own county was a lot of these judges are, running these campaigns, getting elected to family court off the money of the lawyers that are going to be practicing before them.
Oh, no. Wow.
And that's just black and white. I mean, that is, you can't make this stuff up. And what you'll also see in New York a lot with this kind of situation is, how that plays into decision-making and motion practice. And I started, when I started researching it, I looked at all the court dockets, and I wanted to see, in my own situation, how many times the opposing counsel was before certain judges and what his history of filing motions were. Were they aggressive? Were they extensive? And compare that to lawyers that were in the same court just as much and had the same number of caseloads, if you will, and kind of get a sense, well, what was their motion practice like? Were they filing 10 motions in a case?
Right.
And, emotions, for those that might not be plugged into what goes on in courts are just allegations back and forth where, in a divorce, someone alleges, well, you did this and that. And so a lawyer will file a motion, and then the other side will come back and have to file a responsive motion. And mind you, this all takes a lot of money, a lot of time. And, in the interim, while all this is going on, of course, a lot of times the kid is the one that suffers the most.
And you're suggesting, too, that the judge who is seeing these motions go back and forth in an almost unending volley, that this is because of billable hours. The judge has to recognize it, but if the lawyer has helped them get elected, you're saying then the judge has a reason to just let it happen.
Yeah, and especially in these counties that these courts reside in. Look, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of sleuthing on social media to find photographs of judges with their arms around some of the lawyers at social events and participating in these, kind of like a good old boy network, if you will. For someone like me, it was very simple to capture the evidence of a lot of this. And I'm not just talking in my own situation, but I was helping quite a few others behind the scenes isolate information because it is so prevalent and out there, and it's almost obvious. But again, is there an entity out there that is actively looking for this type of information? The answer is no. And then if you look at the ethics committees that are in these regions that are supposed to, be the watchdog, if you will, they're all made up of, lawyers within the same circle of friends, if you will, in the same geographic regions. So there's a conflict of interest there. And, what a lot of people don't recognize is, especially when it's elected judges, these folks were practicing attorneys in family law with the same attorneys that are now, arguing cases in front of them prior to being elected to judges.
Right. So,
a lot of this archaic stuff that ultimately happens, they know the system. They're familiar with the attorneys coming before them, and it's amusing how this all works. There's other little things that a person can recognize that go on that feed into this, and but these are some of the bigger ones that can be dissected and broken down. Because that's where the money goes. That's where, a lot of the empirical evidence, if you will, can be traced to.
Yeah.
And I spent quite a bit of time, kind of plotting it out and charting it out. And if you don't know how to cross-stream the data and you don't know, where to look for it and what you're looking for, it's difficult. It's tedious. It's difficult. But there are ways to prove that this is happening. And once you prove that with the numbers, you can prove the bias side of it.
Yeah.
And that, this judge is going to almost ultimately rule this percentage of time in favor of this attorney because, hey, they may have worked in the same law firm before this person was elected judge. But, a lot of times this data is also shrouded because there's only so much of it you can see. Especially in a state like New York, for example, you have divorces and custody situations playing out in a Supreme Court system, and then a lot of times in a family court system. And, I tell everybody that asks me, at least in this state, which court system is better to, have your case heard in. And I always say the Supreme. It's more transparent. Mm-hmm. These family courts, they hush everything up, and they can get away with more. And there's nobody you can go, raising the red flag to if you've been victimized in any way. It's just not there. Right. And that's the disheartening thing of it. And so, for my situation, I realized early on a lot of the nonsense that was playing out. And I never felt, I remember someone asking me if I consider myself a victim of it all. I never did. I felt that I was the recipient of a lot of crap, is how I put it. Uh-huh. And so there was a turning point where I started just documenting it. And I started, pushing certain buttons of the court to see how they respond and react. And, it was startling. And then, when you find out that you're not the only one going through it and that it's a big, big problem, you begin to scratch your head and you wonder why. Well, why isn't the press here covering some of these bigger, broader issues that are playing out in these systems? And who's here to call to task these judges and these family court systems, and especially a lot of the attorneys that are gaming the system and almost rigging it, if you will, to benefit their clients and to benefit themselves, with the child ultimately suffering.
Well, so do you think there's some kind of implicit belief that we live in a democracy, and so if a judge gets reelected, that's the people voicing, it's a referendum on the judge being a good judge. Otherwise, there's no way he would get reelected.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, and for me, it's interesting because having run myself as a candidate for office, I'll bring this into it only to say that, I used to pride myself because I ran for local positions, and I used to always not focus on the political label of either party, but the issue-oriented, causes, and that's, where I always focused on. But I also discovered that people, in elections tend to vote, either to the D side or the R side, and the same happens with judges. And a lot of these judges go unchallenged sometimes too. But I think the whole election of a family court judge is not the right way to go. I mean, you have to think about the egos of most politicians. What kind of person, runs for office the majority of the times? And not to say that these folks are not good public servants who run for political office or they're bad people, but, I can tell you from my own experience, when you see your name in the press, when you see your name on a ballot, there's a side of you, human nature, that, it builds on your ego, and that happens a lot in these court cases in terms of elections where, judges it's almost the same thing. It's a popularity contest. So by the time they win a position, they've already won an election. Now you're a family court judge, and now you're almost, under all sorts of judicial immunity and whatnot. Your little fiefdom is that courtroom, and you are the ultimate final say. And that's an awesome power to have over parents, over their kids. It translates to a fear factor, and that's the side that voters don't see. They don't see what goes on in the courtroom. So, of course, in public, when they get a shiny, glossy, campaign flyer about a judge, or, see a poster that, this is, the best candidate to run for office, and, they're the Democrat that's going to represent your values, or the Republican that's going to represent your values. Well, how does that translate into the judicial system? What values are they bringing from the left or the right that are refusing them? Do you understand kind of where I'm going?
I do, yeah. And, this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I've often wondered when people who are politicians and they first get involved in the political sphere, there's actually a woman who just got elected for the first time in Delaware. Her name is Lisa Blunt Rochester. And she seems like a legitimately caring and genuine person. And yet there's a part of me that feels, based upon my 50 years here on this earth, that at some point she's going to turn. It just seems like people who get involved politically end up with some level of corruption under their belt, almost invariably. And so do you think that the reason that tends to happen is just because of the power and then the fear that you're going to lose the power? Or are there machinations behind the scene where somebody who gets elected is now being offered secret money to go this way and go that way? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think you can make the argument that all those things are possible, but I think, at the end of the day, what I tend to see is
Steve? I don't know. Something got broken up there.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm saying my thoughts are that, I tend to believe with the, judges and a lot of those situations, it's more about self-preservation for them. And that of course, can lead to, them falling the wayside of corrupt practice and accepting all sorts of beneficial situations. But I think at the end of the day, they make a good living, and they have a long term and they get certain benefits. Look, they're going to work every day. You have to put yourself in the mind of one of these folks. They've been elected to an environment where their gavel is the final say. That's a lot of stuff that builds on their image of themselves, if you will. And it's almost like one of the clerks of the court, that I interviewed not too long ago, who was talking about it, said it's a question of them having a God complex, which often happens. And when you have a God complex and you're making rulings and you're not, separating yourself and your views from the evidence at hand, and the evidence has been manipulated from the get-go because of the players before you, it ultimately, at the end of the day, it hurts the entire system. It hurts the kids. It hurts the integrity of that courtroom. And so I think, a judge will get to a point, or a lawyer will get to the point that's worked in this industry for so long where, it's just mechanical for them. It's just, they've seen 20 cases, and obviously they're probably thinking, well, it's all a formula at this point. This is how it should go, and this is how it shouldn't go. And, I've seen some of that play out, and it's kind of, upsetting, because your right to be heard as a mother or father before these courts is usually infringed upon in the process. And that happens. Look, I could tell you in my own case, and I've heard this from a lot of other people, I captured it on the record with the judge that she hadn't even reviewed the exhibits, the evidence that was filed before her when I had showed up at a hearing one day. And I almost had to laugh. Luckily for me, I bit my tongue. I was representing myself at that time in my proceedings, but I couldn't believe that, here you spend all this time. I mean, I could believe it, but, and you file something before a court, and once you file before a court, you think that, somebody's looking at it somewhere. And that just wasn't the case. Yeah. And, that's where a lot of people spend a lot of resources, money, and time. And kids, look, the kid gets the short end of the stick, and so my thinking on the whole thing is, I think the infrastructure is corrupted as a whole. Right. And I think there are players within it that take advantage of that on an individual level. But I think there are genuine people that work in that industry that are trying to do the right thing. But sometimes there's just no way for them to do the right thing without, playing the system, if you will. And so it gets very muddy, it gets very murky, and at the end of the day, it's dysfunctional. So it's a lot to take in. Yeah. But, and I think when I started out to write about this stuff, I realized that you're dealing with a system that is very complex, very confusing for most people. And, I remember looking around and doing research for my own situation and trying to figure out, well, can someone just explain this to me in plain English? What the heck is going on? There seems to be so many moving parts, and you try to explain those moving parts to your, who's ever representing you as your attorney or somebody else, your best friend. And to them, it just sounds like just a tangled web. You may, think that you're making sense, but to them, it's like, what are you talking about? That you presented this or that, or the judge is doing this, and a lot of these parents are emotional at the time. So what I set out to do was take this complex situation and break it down layer by layer. Great. And try to explain each layer in a narrative that your average Joe could understand, or your college educated individual could understand, or your PhD. And there wasn't a lot of that out there that I found, so I tried to do it.
Great. Well, so we're almost out of time, and I think that it might be good for the listeners to hear, maybe like a top 2 or 3 things that you would advise them to do or be aware of, some advice for just the average person who's either in the family court system now or will be in the near future.
Get a third party involved. Don't go in the court system because you're asking for trouble. And for those of you that are unable to avoid a court system because you're being forced into it, make sure that you have the help that you need on the outside. Get a trained third party that you can talk to. Somebody that can come to your defense if you need it about your mental state. Take the steps that you need to so that you can stay focused, because this thing, these ordeals unravel people, and a lot of people end up destroyed. I mean, look, it's this whole notion that attorneys like to advise their clients, to act calm, cool, and collective in front of the judge and this and that. And, it's almost impossible in these situations because the threat is very big. The threat is, the future you have with your child. And to those folks that are entering this and have it in their head from their attorney that aggressiveness is the way to go and that that's just how it's done, you better think long and hard about your kid or kids because they're going to grow up one day. And you never know what they're going to grasp or understand. And the last thing you want is, 10, 20 years from now, is your kid fully understanding what went on.
Yeah.
And that you had a chance to work things out amicably and, where they could be an equal part of their parents' lives, and you blew it. And you don't want to do that. And do not let your emotions that are raw now be your guiding principles for how your case should go in a court of law, because that leads to nowhere good.
Uh-huh. So you might suggest that people go see a counselor on a periodic basis just to kind of talk through what's going on so that they can express themselves in a safe environment and then go to court and be a little more level-headed. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think that helped me out, and I can't speak for everybody, but that certainly was better than the alternative, and I think it helps you focus on what's most important and get through these tumultuous ordeals.
Wow. Well, this is, as they said in Back to the Future, really heavy.
It is. And look, I would encourage folks, and I continue to write about this stuff, but, one of the reasons we have come out with the book, which is the first volume of 2, it's a compilation of all the articles that have been done over the past couple of years. And, what the publisher and I thought was a good idea to do was, compile them in one place so that folks could just, truly kind of go chapter by chapter and really read what other people have gone through and, kind of a breakdown of what they can expect in some of these situations. And, that's kind of what I tried to do with the book, which is, I'll give the shameless plug. It's called A Broken System, Family Court in the United States. And it's been released a couple weeks ago on Amazon for those of you that want to go looking for it. But it's, I think if you know what you're getting into before you get into it, if you understand the adversarial nature of how these things can play out, you're better off because it's a lot of money. It's a lot of emotional resource that gets invested into all this.
Great. So, now we know about your book, and can you just briefly tell us, where do we find your writing online?
I've been writing for the Huffington Post. A lot of these articles originally appeared on there under the tagline of A Broken System, which, if you Google it around, I'm sure you can figure out and find where that appears.
Yeah.
And then the other place is the Goodman Project, which is, the articles were published on both sites. So for those that go looking, you can find them there. And again, you can find the compilation of them all on Amazon.com.
Great. Well, thanks for being out there. This is something that sounds like it's very valuable. There's so many people that are going to have to go through this system, so it's always good to know what you're getting into, as you said, before you get into it. Maybe you'll recognize something that's happening that you wouldn't have recognized otherwise just by being a little more educated about it.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah.
And listen, thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Sure. Well, I'm thankful that you were here. Thanks so much.
Thank you. You have a good day.
All right, everybody, I'll talk to you next week. Thanks.
Living in a city, when you're in it, watch the people walk by. And if you listen real close, you can hear them talk about their lives. And some hate it, some love it, some are felt, some are just tired. These are the people in the neighborhood, they just trying to make it out right. See, she never wanna be a new IPMNation.com